Iraq's Prime Minister vows to reshuffle his cabinet and announce new reform measures by next week. This as anti-government protests pick up after a 3-week hiatus. Protesters take to the streets of Lebanon for the 9th day in a row. The leader of Hezbollah, meanwhile, warns of the risk of civil war and suggests he's behind the current government after Lebanon's president says a reshuffle could calm the unrest. And Boris Johnson says Brexit is still possible within the next 6 days. This as EU ambassadors agree to delay Britain's exit from the bloc once again. Thank you very much for joining us here on France 24. First, police in the Iraqi capital fired live ammunition in the air to disperse thousands of protesters. The anti-government demonstrations picked up early this Friday after a 3-week lull. According to Iraq's Human Rights Commission, 5 people were killed in today's protests. The country's prime minister has already promised reforms and a government reshuffle by next week. Naomi Lloyd reports.
In the middle of the night, hundreds of cars parade through the streets of Baghdad and protesters head towards the capital's iconic Tahrir Square. A hint of what's to come on Friday, when thousands are expected to take to the streets to demand economic reforms and a clampdown on corruption. Protesters had this message for the Prime Minister.
The old men, the young, the women of Iraq call on you to step down. Yes, you have failed. In a year, you have offered nothing to the country.
Earlier this month, more than 150 civilians were killed during anti-government protests when security forces fired at them with live ammunition. Most of those taking part were young and unemployed, calling for jobs and better public services. On Tuesday, a government committee found that most of the deaths were caused by bullet wounds to the head or chest. The report concluded that officers and commanders had lost control over their forces and recommended senior officers be sacked. In a televised address overnight, the Prime Minister apologised for the shootings.
It was a big mistake to bring in the army to suppress demonstrations. We need to move away from that because the army's job is to fight the enemy.
He promised a cabinet reshuffle and a package of reforms to address protesters' demands. Demonstrators were unimpressed.
You are finished. A prime minister giving a speech at 2 in the morning when people are asleep.
A year to the day since Prime Minister Adel Abdelmahdi came to power, demonstrators blame corrupt officials and political elites for failing to improve their lives.
EU ambassadors gathered in Brussels to discuss pushing back Brexit's deadline once again. The United Kingdom was supposed to exit the bloc in 6 days' time, but after the Prime Minister failed in his efforts to get Parliament to agree on his timetable, Boris Johnson has been forced to call for a snap election to get the numbers he needs to push his Brexit deal through Parliament.
As things stand, we can leave on October the 31st. Parliament, as you know, has decided that they want to ask Brussels to keep us in the EU. That's not my policy. It's not something I support. I'm totally against it. We should be leaving on October the 31st.
That was Boris Johnson speaking there. Now, earlier I spoke to our international affairs editor, Philip Turl, about if Brexit was possible in the next 6 days.
Boris Johnson was actually speaking from a hospital in that clip, which is where the Brexit deal should actually be right now, because however hard he tries to push it through on the 31st of October, he doesn't seem to be able to get there. Now, he has sort of admitted that he's not going to be able to do that in a letter to Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party. But in public, he's still saying, yes, we could leave on the 31st of October.
Because this is the man who said, do or die. We're going to do this on the 31st. Yeah, do or die, or I'd rather be dead in a ditch than go and ask for an extension, which he has since asked for. And that is why the EU ambassadors have, in theory, agreed amongst themselves for an extension. We're not really sure about how long that's going to be. I'll come back to that in a moment. But they're not going to make an announcement on it until Monday or maybe Tuesday. They were going to say today what that duration was going to be. And the reason that they're delaying it until Monday or Tuesday is that on Monday a vote is going to take place in the House of Commons on what Boris Johnson wants, which is what he was talking about
in that clip, which is an early general election to be held on the 12th of December, telling Jeremy Corbyn basically to man up and to vote in favour of that general election. Why to vote in favour? Because Boris Johnson needs Jeremy Corbyn's support to be able to call for the poll. He needs a two-third majority in Parliament to be able to do that. So he needs the Labour Party on board. The Labour Party is split between those who think it's quite a good idea and those who don't think it's a very good idea. And Jeremy Corbyn is stuck between his two rival factions. So I don't think, that's my own feeling, that the Prime Minister is going to get this early election. And the reason that the EU ambassadors are waiting until Tuesday is they want to be sure there will be an early election before they announce the increase in the deadline, possibly until the 31st of January.
Philip Turrell speaking there. Now, police investigating the deaths of 39 people found in a truck in Essex on Wednesday have arrested 2 more suspects. The pair have been picked up on suspicion of human trafficking. The driver, suspected of murder, was arrested on Wednesday itself. Police are now focused on the movement of the truck prior to its arrival in Essex, as well as determining who is behind this trafficking ring. Now, protesters have taken to the streets of Lebanon for the 9th day in a row. The movement, which was largely been peaceful, did witness some instances of violence today. This after protesters of Hezbollah entered the crowd, forcing the police to intervene. The group has announced it's against a change in government and has warned of a civil war in the country after Lebanon's president suggested a reshuffle could calm the unrest.
Protests are entering their 2nd week in Lebanon, and there's no sign of them diminishing. Still out on the streets late into Thursday night, the demonstrators are outraged by what they see as a corrupt ruling class who are responsible for the dire state of the Lebanese economy.
I have 5 children. I'm hungry and I own a business. What do they want us to do? To steal? To leave the country? No. We're staying in this country. We will keep protecting this country.
We're carrying out acts of civil disobedience by blocking roads and protesting across Lebanon.
Earlier in the day, President Michel Aoun pleaded with demonstrators to end the protests, which have brought hundreds of thousands of people onto the streets.
My call to demonstrators. I'm ready to meet your representatives who know your concerns so I can listen to your specific demands. We will discuss what we can do together to achieve your objectives without causing collapse and chaos.
The demonstrations continue in spite of reforms implemented by the Lebanese government since they began last week. It was an attempt to quell the unrest and reassure Western donors who have pledged aid but who are yet to give out the desperately needed financial support. The largely peaceful protests have seen some involved blocking main roads throughout Lebanon, paralysing the country. Schools and other public institutions remain closed, while the country's banking association said banks would stay closed on Friday, only to reopen when the situation stabilises.
Now, next Tuesday, Russian military police and Syrian border guards will begin to clear Kurdish fighters from within 30 kilometers of the Turkish border. This after an agreement was struck between Ankara and Moscow. The arrival of Russian police marks a shift in the regional balance of power after the United States announced it would begin pulling its troops from Syria. Claire Rush reports.
Russia's defense ministry said Friday that it sent 300 additional military police and some 20 armored vehicles to northeastern Syria. This just 2 days after Russian troops began patrolling the region. Moscow has been moving quickly to implement the agreement it negotiated with Ankara earlier this week. Under the deal, Turkey agreed to halt its military offensive against Kurdish forces in the area. This on the condition that Kurdish fighters retreat 30 kilometers from the border by Tuesday. The accord would then allow Turkey to create a so-called buffer zone in the area vacated by the Kurds, where it plans to resettle some 2 million Syrian refugees. But this plan has been opposed by some of Ankara's fellow NATO members, such as Germany, which has called for creating an internationally controlled zone instead.
It is important to create confidence in this region. And confidence is best created by international organizations also having the possibility of sharing control.
The UN says that, for now, the deal brokered by Russia and Turkey seems to be holding, quote, by and large. But the accord remains fragile, with both Turkish and Kurdish troops accusing each other of violating the deal.
That's it from me. Thank you very much for watching.